The billionaire's bite on her neck made her tremble every night. She thought it was a dream. "Who are you?" The words escaped Amy's lips before she could stop them. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hand was wrapped around the wrist of the man kneeling beside her bed. A man she had never seen before. A man whose presence she had felt every night for 3 weeks. A man whose lips had touched her neck in the darkness so many times she had convinced herself she was losing her mind. But she was not losing her mind. He was real. He was here. And he was looking at her with an expression that held equal parts terror and longing. "I can explain," he whispered. "Then explain. Because I have spent 3 weeks thinking I was going insane. 3 weeks waking up to sensations I could not understand. 3 weeks smelling cologne that did not belong to me. 3 weeks hearing whispered words I could not quite catch. Explain to me why you have been coming into my room every night. Explain to me why you have been touching me like I am something precious and then disappearing before I can see your face. Explain to me who you are and why I should not be screaming right now." The moonlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated his features. Sharp jawline, dark hair with threads of silver at the temples, eyes that held depths she could not begin to fathom. He was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, dangerous and compelling and impossible to look away from. "My name is George Rogers," he said, "and I own this estate." Amy's breath caught. George Rogers, the name on her contract. The billionaire recluse who had not been seen in public for 7 years. The man everyone said was either dead or dying or simply too eccentric to engage with the outside world. He was none of those things. He was kneeling beside her bed at 3 in the morning with his wrist still caught in her grip. And he was looking at her like she was the answer to a question he had been asking for years. "You have been watching me," Amy said. It was not a question. "Yes." Through the cameras. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since you arrived. Since the first night you walked into my estate and started talking to the paintings like they could hear you. Since I saw you restore a piece everyone else had given up on and realized you understood something most people never learn. That broken things are not worthless. They just require more patience." Amy should have been furious. She should have been terrified. This man had invaded her privacy in the most profound way possible. He had watched her work, watched her sleep, watched her live her life without her knowledge or consent. But the anger would not come, because underneath his words she heard something else, something that resonated with the empty places inside her own chest. Loneliness, recognition, the desperate hope that someone else might understand. "Why did you not just introduce yourself?" Amy asked. "Why the shadows and the surveillance and the midnight visits?" George's expression crumbled. "Because I was afraid. Because the last time I let someone close, she nearly destroyed everything I had built. Because I have spent 7 years convincing myself that isolation was the same as safety. And then you arrived and I could not stay away. I tried. God knows I tried. But every night my body carried me here without my permission. And every night I told myself it would be the last time. And every night I came back because being near you felt like the only time I was actually alive." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable and terrifying in its honesty. Amy loosened her grip on his wrist, but did not let go entirely. She studied his face in the moonlight, looking for deception, looking for manipulation, looking for any sign that this was another performance by another man who would eventually betray her. She found only fear, the same fear she carried in her own chest. The fear of wanting something you were certain you did not deserve. "Stand up," she said quietly. George rose slowly, uncertain, ready to flee at the first sign of rejection. Amy sat up in bed. The sheets pooled around her waist. She was wearing a simple sleep shirt, nothing provocative, nothing planned. But George looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Sit down," she said, gesturing to the chair by her window, "and tell me everything. From the beginning. Do not leave anything out, because if we are going to figure out what this is, I need to understand who you are. Not the billionaire, not the recluse. You." George sank into the chair. His composure was gone. Whatever armor he had built over 7 years of isolation had been stripped away by her direct gaze and her refusal to run. "It started when I was 7, he began. And Amy listened, not because she trusted him, not because she had forgiven the invasion of her privacy, but because something in his voice told her that he had never said these words to anyone. that she was being given a gift that terrified him to offer. She listened because she recognized the sound of someone desperate to be known. Before we go any further with what George revealed that night, I need to pause and speak directly to you. Have you ever woken from a dream so real you could still feel it on your skin? Have you ever wanted something so desperately that you convinced yourself it could not possibly exist? Have you ever met someone whose damage matched your own so perfectly that it felt less like meeting and more like recognition? Amy Morrison came to Hartwell Estate to hide from a world that had betrayed her. She expected solitude. She expected safety. She did not expect to be haunted by a billionaire who visited her room every night because his unconscious mind kept seeking the one person who made him feel something other than empty. This is a story about broken things, about the courage it takes to trust again after someone has shattered you, about the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone see your cracks and hoping they choose to stay anyway. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson Stories because this journey is only beginning. And trust me when I tell you that what George revealed that night changed everything Amy thought she knew about love, about trust, and about the impossible hope that two damaged people could heal each other. Now let me tell you how Amy Morrison ended up in a Gothic estate on the coast of Maine, working through the night to restore paintings she thought were the only broken things she would encounter. 2 years before she ever heard the name George Rogers, Amy Morrison was living what most people would consider a perfect life. She was the rising star at Morrison Gallery in Boston. The gallery had been founded by her grandfather 50 years earlier. It specialized in restoration and authentication. Collectors from around the world sent their damaged treasures to Morrison Gallery because they knew Amy would treat each piece like it was priceless. Because to her, every piece was priceless. Every painting told a story. Every crack and fade and water stain was evidence of a journey. And Amy believed that journey deserved to be honored, not erased. She had an apartment overlooking the harbor. She had a career that fulfilled her in ways she had never expected. And she had David Harrington. David was everything Amy thought she wanted. He was charming and cultured, and he understood her work because he was a curator himself. They had met at an exhibition opening 4 years earlier. He had made her laugh. He had made her feel seen. He had spent 2 years convincing her that he was different from the men who had disappointed her before. They got engaged on a Tuesday evening. Nothing elaborate. Just the two of them on the harbor walk where they had shared their first kiss. David had gotten down on one knee. He had promised her forever. And Amy had believed him because she wanted to believe that love could be exactly what it appeared to be. She was wrong. The discovery came 3 months after the engagement. Amy had been working late at the gallery, a restoration project that required her full attention. David had left early claiming a dinner meeting with a potential donor. She found his second phone in the pocket of a jacket he had left behind. Later, she would wonder why she opened it, why she did not simply wait and ask him about it, why some instinct had whispered that she already knew what she would find but needed proof before she could accept it. The messages went back 3 years, the entire length of their relationship. Every "I love you" he had whispered to Amy had been echoed in messages to someone else. Every promise of forever had been a lie. The other woman was Claire Donovan, Amy's business partner, her closest friend, the person she had trusted with the financial management of her grandfather's legacy. But the affair was only the beginning of the betrayal. As Amy scrolled through the messages with shaking hands, she discovered something far worse than infidelity. David and Claire had been planning to force her out of Morrison Gallery. They had been manipulating the finances, shifting assets, creating documentation that would allow them to claim Amy was incompetent at best, fraudulent at worst. They were going to steal everything her grandfather had built, and they had been doing it for 3 years while Amy slept beside a man she thought loved her. She did not confront them that night. She could not. The scale of the betrayal was too enormous to process. Instead, she went home to the apartment she shared with David. She packed a bag while he slept. She left her engagement ring on the kitchen counter with a note containing only 2 words. I know. The fallout was catastrophic. David and Claire moved quickly once they realized Amy had discovered their plan. They could not complete the financial takeover without her cooperation, so they destroyed her reputation instead. Within a month, whispers spread through the Boston art world. Amy Morrison was unstable. Amy Morrison had been the one conducting an affair. Amy Morrison had been embezzling from her own gallery. None of it was true, but Claire had spent 3 years positioning herself as the trustworthy one, the reasonable one, the one who could be believed. Friends Amy had known for years suddenly would not return her calls. Colleagues who had praised her work began questioning her expertise. The gallery board sided with Claire because Claire had made certain they would. Amy lost everything: the gallery, the apartment, the career she had spent a decade building, the friends who had turned out to be nothing more than acquaintances who preferred the cleaner story. She moved in with her older sister Elena in Providence. She spent 3 months barely leaving the guest bedroom. She stopped restoring paintings because every time she picked up her tools, she thought about the gallery she had lost and the life she had believed was real. Rock bottom is not a single moment. It is a slow descent, a gradual acceptance that the person you thought you were no longer exists. Amy hit rock bottom on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she caught herself researching how much her engagement ring would have been worth. The ring she had left on the counter. The ring that was probably on Claire's finger now. She realized she was calculating the value of her own pain, trying to quantify what she had lost so she could understand why it hurt so much. That was the moment she decided to stop looking backward, to stop measuring herself against the life David and Claire had stolen, to start building something new, even if she had no idea what that something might be. She took odd restoration jobs, nothing prestigious, nothing that would attract attention from the Boston art world she was trying to escape. Insurance companies who needed damage assessments, private collectors who wanted minor repairs. Enough work to pay her share of rent and prove to herself that her skills had value even if everything else had been taken. 6 months after she left Boston, Amy found the job posting that would change her life. Night restoration specialist, Hartwell Estate, Maine. The position required someone willing to work from midnight to dawn, someone comfortable with complete solitude, someone who could sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and ask no questions about the estate's reclusive owner. The salary was 5 times what comparable positions offered. Amy applied because she had nothing left to lose, because the job description sounded like exactly what she needed. Work that mattered, isolation that protected, a chance to disappear into broken, beautiful things and emerge on the other side as someone new. The interview process was unusual. No face-to-face meetings. Everything conducted through encrypted emails and a single video call with a man named Victor Kane, who identified himself as legal counsel for the estate. Victor asked questions that seemed designed to assess her character more than her technical skills. How did she handle extended periods of solitude? What were her thoughts on privacy, both her own and that of others? Had she ever betrayed a confidence entrusted to her? Amy answered honestly. She had nothing left to pretend about. She was hired within 24 hours. Contracts arrived via secure courier. She signed them without reading the fine print because she needed the escape more than she needed the details. 1 week later, Amy Morrison arrived at Hartwell Estate. The first thing she noticed was the isolation. The estate sat on a rocky peninsula jutting into the Atlantic. The nearest town was 30 miles away. The nearest neighbor was even farther. Whatever direction you looked, there was nothing but ocean and sky and the kind of silence that felt almost physical. The second thing she noticed was the house itself. Gothic Revival architecture. Towers and gables and windows that caught the light like watchful eyes. The kind of house that should have felt menacing, but instead felt protective. A fortress against a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. Mrs. Brennan met her at the door. The estate manager was efficient and professionally warm. She welcomed Amy. She showed her to her quarters in the East Wing. She explained the rules. No wandering beyond designated areas without authorization. No questions about Mr. Rogers or his schedule or his reasons for privacy. No contact with outside visitors unless specifically approved. Amy's workspace was a climate-controlled restoration studio containing artwork worth more than she would earn in 100 lifetimes. Paintings from every era. Damaged masterpieces that had been purchased specifically because they needed her particular expertise. Her quarters were comfortable. A bedroom with antique furniture and tall windows overlooking the ocean. A private bathroom. A small sitting area where she could read during her off hours. Everything she needed. Nothing excessive. That first night, Amy unpacked her few possessions and stood at the window watching the waves crash against the rocks below. She felt something she had not felt since before David. Since before the betrayal and the collapse and the slow, devastating process of accepting that she had trusted the wrong person with everything she had. She felt peace. The silence was not lonely here. It was restorative. The isolation was not punishment. It was protection. She had found a place where she could disappear into her work and emerge only when she was ready. She did not know that someone was watching her through the security cameras. She did not know that the owner of this estate had noticed her the moment she walked through the door. She did not know that her presence had already begun to change everything. Amy's first 3 months at Hartwell Estate passed in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. She woke at 11 each evening. She ate a simple meal prepared by the kitchen staff and left for her in the small dining room adjacent to her quarters. She made coffee and carried it to her studio, and then she worked. The paintings demanded her full attention. Each one presented unique challenges: water damage and fire damage, and the slow, insidious damage of time and neglect. She studied each piece before she began. She researched the original artist's techniques. She tested her materials on hidden sections. She proceeded with the kind of patience that came from understanding that restoration was not about speed. It was about respect. Sometimes she talked to the paintings while she worked, not out loud, at least not always, but in her head she narrated her process, explained to the long-dead artists what she was doing and why, apologized when she had to make difficult decisions about what could be saved and what was lost forever. It helped her focus. It reminded her that she was not just repairing canvas and pigment. She was preserving someone's vision, someone's attempt to capture beauty or truth, or the ineffable experience of being alive. That deserved reverence. That deserved care. At dawn each day, she documented her progress, photographed the work, made notes about next steps. Then she returned to her quarters and slept until the cycle began again. She spoke to Elena twice a week, brief calls that her sister used to assess whether Amy was recovering or simply hiding. Amy understood the concern. She shared enough to prove she was functional. She withheld enough to protect her privacy. Yes, the work is good. Yes, I am eating. Yes, I am sleeping. No, I have not met the owner. I do not think anyone has. He is a ghost who signs paychecks. That is all I know, and all I need to know. Elena worried that Amy was isolating too completely, that she was using solitude as an excuse to avoid processing what had happened in Boston. Maybe she was right, but processing required energy Amy did not have. Solitude required only endurance. Endurance was something Amy had developed in abundance. The first strange moment came at the beginning of her second month. Amy arrived at her studio to find a painting waiting for her that had not been there the night before. A small piece. A landscape showing a storm approaching a rocky coastline. The damage was minimal. A few cracks in the varnish, some minor discoloration, nothing that would take more than a few sessions to address. Attached to the frame was a note written on expensive paper in an elegant hand. This one reminded me of you. No signature, no explanation. Amy studied the painting for a long time before beginning work. The storm in the image was beautiful rather than threatening. The rocks stood firm against the approaching chaos. The light breaking through the clouds suggested that the storm would pass and something clearer would emerge. She did not know who had left the note. She assumed it was Mr. Rogers communicating through intermediaries as he apparently did with everything else. But the personal nature of the message unsettled her. How did he know anything about her? How did he know enough to select a painting that would speak to her so directly? She mentioned it to Mrs. Brennan the next evening. The estate manager's expression flickered with something Amy could not identify before settling back into professional neutrality. Mr. Rogers takes a personal interest in the collection, Mrs. Brennan said. He was likely expressing appreciation for your work. It was an explanation that explained nothing. But Amy had agreed not to ask questions, so she let it go. The second strange moment came a week later. She was working on a portrait that had been badly damaged by smoke. A young woman in Victorian dress. Dark hair, determined expression, eyes that seemed to follow you around the room in that way particularly skilled portraitists could achieve. Amy had been working for several hours. Her back ached from hunching over the restoration table. Her eyes were tired from the precise detail work. She stood to stretch and walked to the window to give herself a few minutes of rest. The moon was full that night. It illuminated the grounds with silver light. The gardens, the path leading to the cliffs, the shadow of someone standing at the edge of the trees. Amy froze. There was a person out there, watching the house. Watching, she realized with a chill, the window where she was standing. She stepped back into the shadows of her studio. Her heart was racing. She had been told the estate was isolated. She had been told security was handled by a discreet team she would never interact with. She had not been told that someone would be watching her from the grounds at 3 in the morning. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She told herself it was nothing. A security guard on patrol. A shadow her tired eyes had misinterpreted. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to disturb the peace she had worked so hard to find. But that night, for the first time since arriving at Hartwell Estate, Amy locked her bedroom door before she slept. The third strange moment changed everything. It happened 3 weeks before the confrontation that would eventually bring her face to face with George Rogers. Amy fell asleep as usual after her shift, the curtains drawn against the morning light, the familiar sounds of the ocean providing white noise, everything exactly as it had been every night for nearly 3 months. She woke, gasping. Her hand flew to her neck. Her pulse was racing. Her skin was tingling in a specific spot just below her ear, a spot that felt warm, a spot that felt like someone had been touching it, like someone had been kissing it. She sat up in bed. Her eyes scanned the room, nothing out of place, nothing moved. The door was still locked from the inside. The windows were sealed against the ocean wind, but she could smell something, faint but unmistakable. Cologne, sandalwood and something darker she could not identify. A scent that did not belong to her. A scent that had not been present when she fell asleep. A dream, she told herself. Just an incredibly vivid dream. She got up. She checked the door. Still locked. She checked the windows. Still sealed. She checked the small bathroom attached to her quarters. Empty. There was no explanation, no rational reason for the sensation still lingering on her neck, no source for the cologne that seemed to dissipate even as she tried to trace it. Amy stood in the center of her room for a long time, her arms wrapped around herself, her logical mind insisting there was nothing to fear, her instincts whispering that something had shifted, something had changed. She told herself she was being ridiculous. She went back to bed. She did not sleep again that day. The sensations returned the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that, each time the same pattern. Amy would fall asleep normally. Hours would pass without incident, and then she would surface slowly from unconsciousness to find that same warmth on her neck, that same tingle of contact, that same ghost of lips against her pulse. She tried staying awake. She drank coffee until her hands shook. She sat in the chair by the window instead of lying in bed. She kept the lights on and her eyes open and her attention fixed on the door that never moved. Nothing happened. The moment she surrendered to exhaustion, the moment her eyes closed and her vigilance failed, the sensations began again. She installed a small camera she had brought from Boston, a security measure Elena had insisted on when Amy first moved into her own apartment after leaving David. She positioned it to capture the bed and the door and the window. She let it run all night while she slept. The footage showed nothing. The door never opened. The window never moved. Amy slept peacefully for hours and then suddenly tensed, her hand rising to her neck, her body responding to something the camera could not see. It was impossible. It was insane. She was a rational person who believed in evidence and explanation, and the evidence was telling her that something was happening that could not be happening. She started keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the same precision she brought to her restoration work. Date, time, duration, specific sensations, any accompanying details. The pattern emerged slowly. The visits always came between 2 and 4 in the morning. The sensations always centered on her neck, though sometimes she felt what might have been fingers trailing across her cheek or through her hair. The cologne was always present, strongest immediately upon waking and fading within minutes. And sometimes, more disturbing than anything else, she could swear she heard words, low and urgent and impossible to decipher, confessions whispered into her sleeping skin. 3 weeks of documentation, 3 weeks of evidence that proved nothing and suggested everything. 3 weeks of slowly accepting that whatever was happening was real, even if she could not explain it. And then something else emerged, something Amy did not want to acknowledge, but could not continue to deny. She was not afraid. She should have been terrified. She should have been calling the police, or demanding answers from Mrs. Brennan, or fleeing this haunted estate for the relative safety of her sister's guest bedroom. Instead, she found herself anticipating the nights, lying awake in the darkness with her heart racing not from fear but from something far more dangerous. Hope, longing, the desperate wish that whatever was visiting her would stay long enough for her to understand what it wanted, what he wanted, because some part of her already knew it was a he. The cologne was masculine. The hands she sometimes felt were large and careful. The whispered words were low and rough in a way that made her think of someone fighting against impulses he could not control. A man was coming into her room at night. A man was touching her with reverence she had not experienced in years. A man was choosing her, even if she could not see his face, even if she did not understand why. The loneliness she had carried since Boston began to crack, not because the visits made sense, not because she trusted what was happening, but because for the first time in 2 years she did not feel invisible. Someone was seeing her. Someone was reaching for her in the darkness. Someone was treating her like she mattered. It was pathetic, she told herself. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that had gotten her destroyed before, but she could not make herself stop wanting it to continue. On the night she finally decided to catch whoever was visiting her, Amy prepared carefully. She ate dinner as usual. She worked her shift as usual. She documented her progress on the smoke-damaged portrait and noted that she would need another 2 weeks to complete the restoration. She returned to her quarters as usual, but instead of going to bed, she sat in the darkness by the window. She positioned herself where she could see both the door and the bed. She regulated her breathing until it mimicked sleep. She waited. Hours passed. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Her body ached with the effort of remaining still. Her eyes burned with the need to close. Every instinct told her to give up, to accept that whatever was happening only occurred when she was actually unconscious. At 2:47, she heard the door handle turn. She had locked it. She knew she had locked it. But the handle turned and the door swung open on silent hinges, and a figure stepped into her room. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had done this many times before. Someone who knew exactly where every piece of furniture was, exactly how many steps to the bed, exactly how to approach without making a sound. He knelt beside her bed. His hand reached toward her face, hovered above her hair, and stopped. Amy opened her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other in the moonlight. Two strangers who were not strangers. Two people meeting for the first time who already knew each other's rhythms. Then Amy's hand shot out and wrapped around his wrist. "Who are you?" The question that had been building for 3 weeks. The question that would change both of their lives forever. And George Rogers, billionaire recluse, medical pioneer, man who had not let anyone touch him in 7 years, looked at the woman holding him captive and told her the truth. "My name is George Rogers. I own this estate, and I have been falling in love with you for 3 months without ever intending to let you know I existed." Now we return to that moonlit bedroom where Amy has just demanded that George explain everything from the beginning, where a man who has spent 7 years in isolation is about to share his story with the first person who has made him want to speak, where two people broken by betrayal are about to discover that their damage matches in ways neither of them expected. George settled into the chair by the window. The moonlight caught the silver at his temples and the sharp angles of his face. He looked exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from the effort of maintaining walls that had just collapsed entirely. "I was 7 when my parents died," he began. His voice was rough, unused to speaking this much. "Car accident on the highway. I was in the back seat. I walked away without a scratch. They were gone before the ambulance arrived." Amy did not offer platitudes. She had received enough empty comfort after Boston to know how hollow words could be. Instead, she simply listened, her presence an invitation to continue. Foster care, after that. George's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. "The system tries. Some families try harder than others. I learned early that attachment was dangerous, that everyone leaves eventually, that the safest strategy was to need no one and expect nothing." "How did you survive that?" Amy asked. "I found something that could not leave me." He almost smiled. "My mind. I could study. I could learn. I could lose myself in problems that had solutions. Biology fascinated me because bodies were systems. Predictable, understandable. Unlike people who said one thing and meant another and left when you needed them most." The bitterness in his voice was old, worn smooth by years of carrying it. "Full scholarship to MIT, then Stanford for my PhD. I was studying neurological disorders, trying to understand why some brains could not process connection the way others did, why some people seemed incapable of the attachment that came easily to everyone else." "You were studying yourself," Amy said quietly. George met her eyes. Yes, I did not realize it at the time. But yes, I was trying to understand why I was broken, why I could not seem to want what other people wanted, why every relationship I attempted felt like wearing clothes that did not fit. What did you find? I found that the brain is more adaptable than anyone realized. That damage can be addressed if you understand the underlying mechanisms. That isolation is not a permanent condition, but a response to trauma that can theoretically be reversed. He paused. I founded Rogers Medical Innovations when I was 24. I wanted to help people like me, people whose brains had decided that connection was too dangerous and had shut down the systems that made it possible. The company was a success, more than a success. By 28, I was a billionaire. By 30, I was on the cover of every magazine that covered medical technology. I was changing lives. I was proving that my approach worked. I was also completely alone, because you could not apply your own discoveries to yourself, because applying them required vulnerability, required letting someone close enough to actually matter, and I had spent my entire life making certain that would never happen. He stood abruptly, walked to the window, stood with his back to her looking out at the ocean. And then I got diagnosed, he said. The same condition I had dedicated my career to treating. Rare, degenerative. The cruel irony was not lost on me. Amy rose from the bed. She crossed to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. What does the condition do? It affects the neural pathways related to human connection. Left untreated, the brain progressively loses the ability to process intimacy, to recognize emotional cues, to feel anything other than the dull roar of isolation. Eventually, it leads to complete withdrawal. The brain decides that interaction is too costly and simply stops supporting it. That sounds terrifying. It is. George turned to face her. But there is a treatment, one my company developed. I have been managing the condition for 6 years. Regular doses of a compound that supports the damaged pathways. It keeps me functional. It keeps me alive. The side effects? Amy guessed. George's expression shifted. You are perceptive. You have been sleepwalking into my room for 3 weeks. I assume that is not typical behavior. No. The sleepwalking started 6 months ago. The doctors thought it was just a temporary adjustment, a neural misfiring. But it kept getting worse, more directed, like my unconscious mind was trying to tell me something my conscious mind refused to accept. And what was it trying to tell you? George held her gaze. That isolation was killing me faster than the disease. That I needed someone. And somehow, even in sleep, I kept finding my way to you. The confession hung between them. Enormous and impossible, and somehow exactly what Amy had needed to hear. Why me? She asked. Of everyone in the world, why would your unconscious mind choose me? I do not know, George admitted. I have asked myself that question every night for 3 months. Maybe it was how you talked to the paintings, like they deserved respect, like they had stories worth preserving. Maybe it was the way you worked, patient and careful, and willing to spend weeks on a piece anyone else would have given up on. Maybe it was something I saw in your face when you thought no one was watching, some sadness that matched my own. He reached out. His hand hovered near her cheek but did not make contact. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe my unconscious mind recognized that you were exactly what I needed. Someone who understood damage. Someone who made broken things beautiful again. Someone who might be able to do the same for me. Amy caught his hovering hand, brought it to her cheek herself, felt him tremble at the contact. You should know, she said quietly, that I came here to hide. I was destroyed by someone I trusted, and I ran away to this isolated place because I thought solitude was safer than risking that kind of pain again. I know. George's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. I read your application. I knew about Boston before you arrived. You knew and you hired me anyway? I hired you because of it. Because I recognized the wound. Because I thought someone who had survived that kind of betrayal would understand the value of privacy, would not ask questions I could not answer, would simply do her work and leave me in peace. But that is not what happened. No. George's voice broke slightly. That is not what happened. You arrived and you were everything I expected and nothing I was prepared for. You were wounded but not destroyed. Careful, but not cold. Isolated by choice, but still capable of connection. And I watched you on the cameras and I told myself it was for security. Told myself I was protecting my investment. told myself anything other than the truth, which was that I was falling in love with you, against my will, against every wall I had built, against everything I had learned about the danger of letting anyone matter. I was falling in love with a woman I had never met, because watching her restore broken things made me believe that maybe I could be restored too. The words settled over Amy like a benediction. She should not believe them. She had believed words before, and they had been lies. She had trusted her judgment before, and it had been catastrophically wrong. But George was not David. His vulnerability was not a performance. The terror in his eyes was not manufactured to manipulate her emotions. This was a man who had spent 7 years in isolation because betrayal had taught him that connection was dangerous. This was a man whose medical condition made vulnerability physically costly. This was a man who had just confessed feelings he clearly wished he did not have because she had demanded truth and he was too exhausted to offer anything else. Amy had 2 choices. She could protect herself, send him away, request a transfer to a different position, return to the safety of solitude that had been working perfectly well before he disrupted it. Or she could take a risk. She chose the risk. "I need you to understand something," she said, her hand still pressed against his warmth seeping into her palm. "I am not the same person I was 2 years ago. I am harder, more guarded, less willing to ignore warning signs or accept behavior that feels wrong. If we are going to figure out what this is, it has to be on equal terms. No more watching from shadows. No more surveillance I do not know about. No more power imbalance where you control my employment and my living situation and my access to the outside world." George nodded immediately. "Whatever you need, whatever boundaries you set, I will respect them. I am not finished." Amy's grip on his hand tightened. "If you hurt me, if you lie to me, if you give me any reason to believe this is manipulation rather than genuine connection, I will walk away. I will not give you a second chance. I will not let myself be destroyed again for someone else's convenience. I understand. Do you? Because I am not threatening you. I am telling you who I am now. I am someone who survived what David did to me, who rebuilt herself from nothing, who learned the hard way that trust is not something you give freely. It is something that has to be earned. And you, George Rogers, have not earned it yet. You have only earned the opportunity to try." George absorbed her words with visible relief rather than defense. "That is more than I deserve," he said, "and more than I expected. I do not want your trust given freely. I want to earn it. I want to prove through actions rather than words that I am not the man who would hurt you, that I am capable of being the man you need." "Then we start tomorrow," Amy said. "You stop watching me through cameras. You introduce yourself properly. You tell me about your condition and what it requires. You let me decide how much contact I am comfortable with and when. We build this slowly, carefully, the way I would approach a damaged painting that everyone else had given up on." George's expression transformed. The fear did not disappear entirely, but something else emerged alongside it. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. "I can do that," he said. "For you, I can do whatever it takes." "Good." Amy released his hand and stepped back. "Now get out of my room. It is nearly 4 in the morning, and I need to process everything you just told me before I can think clearly enough to know what I actually feel." George moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "Amy." "What?" "Thank you. For not running. For demanding truth instead of accepting whatever story I tried to give you. For seeing that I was terrified and choosing to stay anyway." Amy almost smiled. "Do not thank me yet. I have not decided if I am staying. I have only decided that you deserve the chance to convince me you are worth the risk. That is enough." George met her eyes one final time. "For now, that is more than enough." He left. The door closed behind him, and Amy stood alone in her moonlit room with her hand pressed against her neck where his lips had touched so many nights. She should be afraid. She should be making plans to leave. She should be protecting herself from another man who might destroy her. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in 2 years. She felt possibility. "I need to pause here and speak directly to you one more time. We have reached the midpoint of this story. Amy knows the truth about who has been visiting her room. George has confessed feelings he spent 7 years trying not to develop. 2 broken people have agreed to try building something neither of them is certain they deserve. But this is not the end. This is barely the beginning. Because trust built slowly can be shattered quickly. Because enemies from the past have ways of finding you when you least expect them. Because the same medical condition that led George to Amy is about to threaten everything they're trying to build. If you are invested in seeing whether Amy and George can survive what is coming, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson Stories and turn on notifications. Comment below and tell me what you think is going to happen next. Tell me whether you believe people can change, whether damage can be healed, whether two people who have been shattered can find wholeness in each other. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that second chances are possible, that loneliness is not permanent, that sometimes the most terrifying dream turns out to be exactly what you needed. Now let me tell you what happened when George Rogers stopped hiding in the shadows and began trying to deserve the woman who had demanded truth and received it. The morning after their confrontation, Amy did not sleep. She sat in the chair by her window and watched the sun rise over the Atlantic. The water shifted from black to gray to silver to gold. The world continued as if nothing had changed, as if she had not just agreed to take a risk on a man who had been watching her for 3 months without her knowledge. She should be angry. She knew that. The rational part of her brain kept insisting that what George had done was a violation. Surveillance without consent, entry into her private space while she slept, touches she had not agreed to, even if they had been gentle, even if some part of her had welcomed them before she understood their source. But anger would not come. And the reason it would not come frightened her almost as much as George himself. She had felt seen. For the first time since David, someone had been paying attention. Someone had noticed the way she talked to paintings. Someone had selected artworks specifically because it reminded him of her. Someone had been watching not to control but to understand. That did not make it acceptable, but it made it complicated in ways Amy was not prepared to untangle at 6 a.m. after a sleepless night. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Morrison," Mrs. Brennan's voice carried through the wood. "Mr. Rogers has requested your presence for breakfast. If you are willing." Amy considered refusing, maintaining the boundaries she had established, making him wait until she was ready. But she was curious, and curiosity had always been stronger than caution in her nature. "Tell him I will be there in 30 minutes. She showered. She dressed in clothes that were professional but not formal. She examined her reflection in the mirror and tried to see what George saw. A woman who talked to paintings. A woman who had survived betrayal. A woman who might be capable of restoring more than just damaged artwork. She did not see anything special, but perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the most meaningful connections happened between ordinary people who simply recognized something in each other that the rest of the world had missed. The breakfast room was smaller than Amy had expected. Not the formal dining hall she had glimpsed during her initial tour of the estate. This was intimate. A table for two positioned beside windows that overlooked the gardens. Fresh flowers in a simple vase. Sunlight streaming through glass that had been cleaned so recently it was nearly invisible. George stood when she entered. He was wearing casual clothes. No suit, no armor of wealth and status. Just a man in a sweater and slacks who looked like he had not slept any better than she had. "Thank you for coming." His voice was uncertain. "I was not sure you would." "I was not sure either." Amy took the seat across from him. "But I decided that hiding in my room would not answer any of the questions I have." "What questions?" "All of them." Amy accepted the coffee that a silent server poured before disappearing. "You told me your story last night, the broad strokes, but I need details if I'm going to understand what I am getting into." George nodded. "Where would you like me to start?" "Tell me about your condition. What exactly does it do? What does the treatment involve? What happens if the treatment stops working?" He took a breath, organized his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice had the precision of someone who had explained this many times to doctors and lawyers and board members. But underneath the clinical language, Amy could hear the fear. The condition is called neural connectivity disorder, NCD. It affects the pathways in the brain that process social and emotional information. In a healthy brain, these pathways develop naturally through childhood attachment and continue strengthening through adult relationships. In someone with NCD, the pathways are damaged or underdeveloped. The brain cannot process connection the way it should. Is it genetic? Sometimes. In my case, the doctors believe it was triggered by trauma. My parents' death, the years in foster care, The brain decided that connection was dangerous and began pruning the pathways that supported it. By the time I was an adult, those pathways were significantly impaired. But you built a company. You interacted with people. You seemed functional. Seemed is the key word. George's hands tightened around his coffee cup. I learned to perform connection without actually experiencing it. I could read social cues intellectually. I could respond appropriately. I could make people believe I understood them. But internally, I felt nothing, or nearly nothing. Just a vague awareness that something was missing, a sense that everyone else was speaking a language I could not quite hear. That sounds lonely. It was. George met her eyes. But I did not realize how lonely until the condition began progressing, until the performance became harder to maintain, until I started losing even the limited capacity I had. When did that happen? 6 years ago. I was 30. I had been pushing myself for years, building the company, ignoring the warning signs, telling myself that success would eventually fill the emptiness. And then one day, I could not get out of bed, could not make myself care about anything, could not feel anything except a profound exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. You crashed. Completely. George set down his cup. The doctors ran every test available. They found the NCD. They told me that without treatment, the condition would continue progressing until I was completely incapable of human interaction, until my brain simply stopped trying. But there was treatment. Treatment I had helped develop. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent years creating compounds that could support damaged neural pathways. I just never imagined I would need them myself. Amy absorbed this. The picture forming in her mind was not of a mysterious recluse, but of a frightened man fighting against his own brain. What does the treatment involve? Daily injections of a compound that supports the damaged pathways. The compound mimics the neurochemicals that healthy attachment produces. It does not cure the condition. Nothing can rebuild pathways that have been pruned away. But it slows the progression. It maintains whatever capacity remains. Side effects? Some. Fatigue, occasional disorientation, and more recently, the sleepwalking. George's expression shifted. The doctors believe the sleepwalking is connected to the treatment's effect on my unconscious mind. The compound is supporting pathways that have been dormant for years. My brain is essentially relearning what it means to want connection. And apparently, what it wants is you. That is a lot of pressure to put on someone you just met. I know. George leaned forward. And I am not asking you to fix me. I am not asking you to be my treatment or my salvation or anything else that would be unfair to demand from another person. I am just trying to explain why I behaved the way I did. Why my unconscious mind kept seeking you out. Why I could not stay away even when I knew I should. Amy was quiet for a long moment, processing, evaluating, trying to separate the information from the emotion. What happens if the treatment stops working? George did not look away. The condition progresses. My capacity for connection continues to decline. Eventually, I lose the ability to interact meaningfully with anyone. My life becomes increasingly isolated until the isolation becomes permanent. How long? Without treatment? Months. With treatment, the doctors estimate I have maintained enough capacity to continue functioning for years, possibly decades, but it requires consistent management. And recent developments suggest that the treatment alone may not be enough. What developments? The sleepwalking. George's voice dropped. The doctors believe my brain is trying to tell me something. That pharmaceutical support can only do so much. That actual human connection, real relationship, genuine attachment, might be necessary to maintain the pathways that remain. That isolation is accelerating the decline rather than protecting me from it. So, you need me. No. George's response was immediate. I want you. There is a difference. I could find other ways to address my medical needs. I could hire companions. I could force myself into social situations. I could treat connection as therapy rather than relationship. But that is not what I am looking for. I am looking for something real, something mutual. Someone who chooses to be with me because they want to be, not because I need them to be. And if I choose not to be, then I let you go. George's hands were trembling slightly. I will not trap you here. I will not use my condition to manipulate you into staying. If you decide that this is too complicated, too risky, too much, I will accept that. I will find another way to manage. I will survive. But you would rather not have to. No, I would rather have you, but not at the cost of your freedom or your well-being. I have spent 7 years learning to live alone. I can spend another 7 if that is what you need." Amy studied his face, looking for deception, looking for the subtle signs of manipulation she had learned to recognize after David. The rehearsed sincerity, the calculated vulnerability, the performance of emotion designed to achieve a specific outcome. She found none of it. What she found instead was a man who was telling the truth, even though the truth made him vulnerable. A man who was offering her an exit even though taking it would cost him something precious. "I am not going to decide right now," she said finally. "I need time. I need to see whether your actions match your words. I need to understand what being with you would actually look like before I commit to anything. That is fair. I also need you to understand that my hesitation is not about your condition. It is about what happened to me in Boston. I trusted someone completely, and they used that trust to destroy me. I am not capable of blind faith anymore. I need proof." "What kind of proof?" "Show up." Amy's voice carried the weight of everything she had learned about relationships, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts or dramatic declarations. Just show up, consistently, reliably. Be who you say you are day after day until I have enough evidence to believe it is real. George nodded slowly. "I can do that. We will see." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Amy had experienced before. George kept his word about the surveillance. The cameras in her quarters were disabled. Her privacy was restored. When he wanted to see her, he came to her door and asked permission like any normal person would. He started appearing at her studio during her working hours, not intruding, just present. He would sit in a corner with his own work, laptop open, attention divided between his company and her. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they worked in comfortable silence. Sometimes he asked questions about her restoration process and listened to her answers with genuine interest. The first time he saw her talking to a painting, he smiled. "Which one is this?" Amy looked up from the portrait she had been addressing, the smoke-damaged Victorian woman she had been working on for weeks. "I call her Lady Patience. She has been through a lot, but she is not ready to give up yet." George crossed the room to stand beside her. "The damage is significant, yes, but she is still there underneath. The original artist was extraordinary. These eyes, this expression, the subtle way the light catches her hair. Someone created something beautiful. The damage does not erase that. That is what you said about broken things, that they require more patience, not that they are worthless." Amy glanced at him. "You remember that?" "I remember everything you have said." George's voice was quiet. "I remember the first time I watched you work. You were restoring a landscape that had water damage. Most of it was gone, just fragments of what it used to be. But you spent 3 weeks bringing it back. You treated it like it mattered, like it deserved the effort, even though no one would have blamed you for declaring it beyond repair. It did matter. Every piece matters. They carry stories. They represent someone's attempt to capture something true about the world. I do not get to decide which stories are worth preserving." George was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that surprised her. "Can you teach me?" "Teach you what?" "How to see what you see. How to look at something damaged and understand that the damage is not the whole story. I have spent my entire life evaluating things by their current condition. Functional or broken, useful or worthless. I never learned to look for what might be there underneath." Amy considered the request. It was not something she had ever tried to teach. Her approach to restoration was intuitive, built over years of practice, not easily translated into lessons for beginners. But she found herself wanting to try. "Sit down," she said. "Watch what I do. Ask questions, and be patient." He sat. He watched. He asked questions that showed he was actually paying attention rather than just performing interest. And Amy found herself explaining things she had never put into words before. The way she read the original artist's intention from the surviving brushstrokes, the chemistry of different pigments and how they reacted to various types of damage, the philosophy that guided her choices, the balance between preserving what remained and reconstructing what was lost. George listened with an intensity that reminded her of her own early training, like he was not just learning a skill but absorbing a worldview. "You approach everything as if it has inherent value," he observed after she had finished explaining a particularly delicate procedure, "as if worthiness is assumed rather than earned. Paintings do not have to earn my respect. They exist. They were created by someone who cared enough to create them. That is enough. Do you approach people the same way? Amy paused. The question cut closer to something she had not examined. I used to, she admitted. Before Boston, I used to assume people were worthy of trust until they proved otherwise. David taught me that assumption was naive. And now I assume nothing. People have to prove themselves, which is probably healthier, but it is also exhausting and lonely. George absorbed this. Then he said something that made her stop working entirely. What if the point is not whether people have to earn trust or receive it freely? What if the point is finding people who understand that either approach is a response to damage? People who do not require you to be undamaged before they will connect with you. Amy looked at him, really looked at him. This man who had spent 7 years in isolation because betrayal had taught him connection was dangerous. This man whose brain was literally losing the capacity for attachment. This man who was sitting in her studio asking questions about restoration because he wanted to understand how she saw the world. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I do not know. Someone more arrogant. Someone who would use his condition as an excuse rather than an explanation. Someone who would expect me to feel sorry for him. Do you feel sorry for me? No. Amy returned to her work. I feel curious and cautious, and something else I am not ready to name yet. George smiled. That is more than I hoped for. The pattern continued for weeks. George appearing at her studio, long conversations about art and damage, and the strange parallel between restoration and healing. Dinners that started formal and became gradually more comfortable. Walks through the estate grounds where George pointed out his favorite views and Amy pretended not to notice how carefully he was trying to share his world with her. She began to look forward to his presence, to feel disappointed when he had meetings that kept him away, to find herself thinking about him during her working hours and wondering what he was doing. The walls she had built after Boston were not crumbling. They were being carefully excavated. George was not trying to tear them down. He was trying to find the door. 1 month after their initial confrontation, Amy admitted to herself that the door might already be open. They were in the gardens, evening light turning everything golden. George had been telling her about the medical research his company was pursuing, treatments that could help people with various forms of neural damage. Amy had been listening, asking questions, impressed by his passion despite herself. Why did you stop appearing in public? She asked when he finished. You were building something important. You were helping people. Why did you retreat so completely? George was quiet for a long moment. His expression shifted from openness to something more guarded. Miranda, he said finally. The name meant nothing to Amy. Who is Miranda? Someone I trusted. George's voice hardened. Someone I let close. Someone who used that closeness to nearly destroy everything I had built. What happened? We met at a medical conference. She was a neurologist. Brilliant. Beautiful. Interested in my research in ways that seemed genuine. I was 32 and lonely in ways I did not even have language for. She seemed to understand. She seemed to accept my condition without judging it. She made me believe that I was not fundamentally broken, that someone could love me despite everything. Amy recognized the hope in his description, the desperate wish to be chosen by someone who saw your damage and stayed anyway. She had felt that hope with David. She had learned how dangerous it could be. You got engaged. Yes, 6 months after we met. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I had evaluated her thoroughly. But the truth was, I wanted so badly to believe that I ignored every warning sign. What warning signs? Her questions were always a little too specific. Her interest in my work was always a little too focused on the financial implications. She asked for access to files that should have been restricted. She met with people at my company without telling me. You did not notice? I noticed. I chose not to see. George's jaw tightened. There is a difference. I was so desperate for connection that I convinced myself every red flag was a misunderstanding. Every suspicious behavior was innocent. Every lie was a minor thing that did not really matter. What did she do? She waited until I was incapacitated during a treatment crisis. My condition flares sometimes, requires intensive intervention. During one of those flares, when I was barely conscious and completely vulnerable, she made her move. George turned away from Amy, his shoulders rigid with remembered pain. She tried to execute a hostile takeover of my company. She had documentation suggesting she had contributed significantly to my research and deserved ownership stake. She had been feeding information to my competitors for months. She had positioned herself to take control of everything I had built the moment I was too weak to stop her. That is monstrous. Yes, George's voice was flat. She would have succeeded if Victor Kane had not discovered what she was doing. He'd been suspicious of her from the beginning. He'd been gathering evidence quietly. When she made her move, he was ready to counter it. What happened to her? Legal proceedings that dragged on for 2 years. She did not get my company, but she got something almost as valuable, my belief that I could ever trust anyone again. He turned back to face Amy. His expression was not seeking pity. It was offering explanation. That is why I retreated. That is why I stopped appearing in public. That is why I have spent 7 years alone in this estate watching the world through screens and pretending that was enough. Miranda taught me that my judgment could not be trusted, that my desire for connection made me vulnerable to manipulation, that the safest course was to need no one and want nothing. But you do want something. Amy stepped closer to him. You want me. Yes, and it terrifies me more than you can imagine. Because what if I am wrong again? What if my judgment is still broken? What if I have found another Miranda wearing different clothes? I am not Miranda. I believe that. George reached out and touched her cheek gently. I believe it with a certainty I have not felt about anyone in 7 years. But the believing is what frightens me. Because I believed her too. I was certain she was genuine. And I was wrong. Amy covered his hand with her own, held it against her face. I cannot prove I am not going to hurt you, she said quietly. I cannot offer guarantees that I will never betray your trust. All I can tell you is that I know what betrayal feels like. I know how it shatters everything you thought you understood about yourself and the world, and I would never willingly inflict that on another person, especially not on someone who has already survived it once. George's breath caught. His eyes were shining in the evening light. Amy, I need to tell you something. What? I have not touched anyone in 7 years. Not really. Not with intention and desire and hope. I have shaken hands and accepted brief contact that social situations required. But I have not allowed anyone to touch me the way I want you to touch me, the way I have been touching you in my sleep without remembering. Amy's heart was racing. The admission was more intimate than any physical contact could have been. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to know what it feels like. To be touched by someone who knows everything about me and chooses to stay anyway. To feel connection rather than just performing it. To discover whether all those damaged pathways in my brain can still recognize something real. She did not make him wait. She did not require more assurances or additional proof. In that moment, looking at his terrified, hopeful face, she understood that some risks could not be calculated. Some decisions had to be made with insufficient information. Some leaps had to be taken, even when you could not see where you would land. She kissed him. It was gentle, questioning. A first kiss between two people who had forgotten what first kisses felt like. His lips were warm against hers. His body was trembling. His hand came up to cup the back of her head with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they separated, George looked at her like she had given him something precious. I felt that, he whispered. I actually felt it. Amy smiled. Good, because I felt it too. I need to pause here and speak directly to you. We have reached the moment where Amy and George begin to believe that something beautiful might be possible, that their damage might match in ways that could lead to healing rather than destruction, that the walls they built for protection might actually be keeping out the very thing they need. But I need you to understand something. This story is not over. The greatest threats are not inside these walls. They are coming from outside. And what happens next will test everything Amy and George have started to build. If you are invested in their journey, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that even the most damaged people can find connection if they are brave enough to try. Comment below and tell me what you think is going to happen. Tell me whether you believe Miranda is truly gone, or whether the past has a way of returning when you least expect it. Because in this story, as in life, the moments when you finally allow yourself to hope are often the moments when hope becomes most dangerous. Now let me tell you what happened when the outside world finally found its way into the sanctuary Amy and George had created together. The weeks following their first kiss were unlike anything either of them had experienced. George began appearing at Amy's quarters after his treatment each evening. They talked for hours in the darkness. Something about not being able to see each other clearly made honesty easier. Confessions whispered into shadows that felt safer than declarations made in daylight. Amy told him about the gallery, about the specific cruelty of watching her grandfather's legacy being taken over by the people who had betrayed her, about the friends who had chosen sides without ever asking for her version of events. George told her about his childhood, about specific foster homes and specific disappointments, about the way he had learned to anticipate abandonment so it would hurt less when it inevitably came. They were mapping each other's damage, learning the geography of each other's wounds, and in that mapping they were finding that the territories were not so different. I have not told anyone these things, Amy admitted during their third week of midnight conversations. Not even Elena. Some of them I had not admitted to myself. Why are you telling me? Because you understand without requiring me to explain. You know what it feels like to have your judgment destroyed, to doubt your own perception of reality, to wonder whether you are capable of seeing anything clearly ever again. George reached for her hand in the darkness. Their fingers intertwined. I have spent 7 years believing I was protecting myself by staying alone, he said. I did not realize I was also punishing myself, telling myself I did not deserve connection because I had failed to recognize Miranda's true nature. You were a victim. You do not need to be punished for being deceived. Neither do you, George replied. David's betrayal was not a reflection of your judgment. It was a reflection of his character. You could not have seen it coming because he was designed to be invisible until it was too late. The words settled over Amy like a blanket. She had known this intellectually. She had told herself similar things during the long months of recovery. But hearing it from someone who understood, from someone who had survived the same destruction, made it feel different, real, believable. I am starting to feel things I did not think I could feel anymore, she admitted. What kinds of things? Hope. Amy's voice was barely audible. The possibility that the future might be different from the past. The belief that not everyone will eventually betray me. George squeezed her hand. I feel it too. And it terrifies me. Because hope is what makes you vulnerable. Hope is what lets people in close enough to hurt you. So what do? We keep going anyway. George's voice carried a determination that surprised her. We acknowledge the terror and choose to move forward despite it. We build something together and accept that it might eventually break. We take the risk because the alternative is worse. What is the alternative? Staying alone forever, never feeling anything except the dull satisfaction of having protected yourself. Arriving at the end of your life and realizing you survived but you never actually lived. Amy turned toward him in the darkness. She could barely see his face, just the outline of his features, the glint of his eyes. When did you become so wise? I am not wise. I am desperate. George almost laughed. I have spent 7 years convincing myself that wisdom meant avoiding risk. Now, I am beginning to wonder if wisdom actually means understanding which risks are worth taking. And I am worth taking a risk for? You are worth everything, George said simply. I did not know that when I hired you. I did not know it when I started watching through the cameras. But I know it now. You are worth every fear I have to face, every wall I have to take down, every vulnerability I have to expose. Amy kissed him, not gentle this time, urgent, filled with all the wanting she had suppressed for 2 years. His response was immediate, pulling her closer, his hands in her hair, his breath mixing with hers. When they finally separated, both of them were trembling. I want this, Amy whispered. I want you, but I need you to understand that I am still scared, that there will be moments when I pull away, or question everything, or need reassurance that you are actually real. I understand. George pressed his forehead against hers. And I will be here for all of it. The trust and the doubt, the hope and the fear. I will not disappear when things get difficult. I will not choose someone easier just because you challenge me. The promise hung between them. Neither of them knew if it could be kept, but both of them wanted to try. 6 weeks after their first kiss, Victor Kane arrived at Hartwell Estate with news that shattered everything. Amy was in her studio when George came to find her. His face was pale. His composure was gone. Whatever he had just learned had stripped away every wall he had carefully maintained. What is wrong? Miranda, George said. She is back. The name hit Amy like a physical blow, even though she had never met the woman, even though Miranda was nothing but a character in George's painful history. The name carried weight, threat, the promise of destruction. What do you mean she is back? She has filed a lawsuit. George sank into the chair Amy had come to think of as his. She is claiming partial ownership of my patents. She says she contributed to the research that led to the treatment keeping me alive. She has documentation that allegedly proves her involvement. Is any of it true? No. The research was mine. Every breakthrough, every innovation, every critical discovery. She was present during some of it, but she contributed nothing except betrayal. The documentation is fabricated. Can you prove that? Victor believes so, but proving it will require a legal battle, public scrutiny, examination of my medical records and my company's proprietary research. Everything I have spent 7 years protecting. Amy set down her restoration tools, crossed the room to kneel beside his chair. This is not just about the lawsuit, is it? No. George's voice was hollow. If she wins, she could take control of the treatment keeping me alive. She could own the patent to the compound my brain depends on. She could decide whether I receive it or not. The implication was horrifying. Miranda was not just attacking George's company. She was attacking his survival. We will fight her, Amy said. Whatever it takes. Whatever resources you need. I am not going anywhere. George looked at her with an expression that broke her heart. Gratitude mixed with terror, mixed with something else she could not identify. There is more, he said. What more? Victor received intelligence about Miranda's strategy. She knows about you. She knows we have been seen together on the estate grounds. She is planning to use our relationship as evidence of my instability. That is absurd. Is it? George's laugh was bitter. A reclusive billionaire with a documented neurological condition suddenly emerges from isolation because of a new relationship. A woman with no previous connection to his world who appeared conveniently just as his condition was worsening. Miranda will argue that you are manipulating me, that our relationship proves I am not capable of making sound decisions about my own affairs. Amy felt cold. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Miranda was going to use Amy's presence to destroy George. And Amy's history, her ruined reputation, her questionable judgment demonstrated by her relationship with David, would only support Miranda's narrative. She's going to dig into my past, Amy said. She is going to find David and Claire. She is going to use everything that happened in Boston to make me look like exactly the kind of person who would take advantage of a vulnerable man. Yes. George reached for her hand. Victor has already confirmed it. Her investigators have been asking questions in Boston. They have been building a case that portrays you as a predator and me as a victim. The injustice of it made Amy want to scream. She had spent 2 years recovering from betrayal. She had rebuilt herself from nothing. She had finally found someone who saw her clearly and chose to stay. And now that relationship was being weaponized against both of them. I could leave, she said. Remove myself from the equation. If I am not here, she cannot use me against you. No. George's grip on her hand tightened. Absolutely not. I am not sending you away to appease Miranda. I am not letting her control my life from the outside the way she tried to control it from the inside. If we separate now, she wins. She proves that connection makes me weak. She demonstrates that I am better off alone. But staying might destroy you. Leaving would destroy me faster. George's voice carried a conviction that silenced her protests. You are the reason I have felt anything in 7 years. You are the reason I believe there might be a future worth fighting for. If I sacrifice that to survive, what exactly am I surviving for? Amy looked at him. This man who had spent 7 years building walls. This man whose brain was literally losing the capacity for connection. This man who was choosing her over safety because he had finally learned that safety without love was just a different kind of death. Then we fight together, she said. Together, George agreed. But the fight had barely begun when everything got worse. 2 days after Victor delivered news of the lawsuit, Miranda arrived at Hartwell Estate. She came without warning, without appointment. She simply appeared at the gates and demanded entry in terms that suggested she still believed she had power here. George refused to see her. Victor conveyed the refusal through appropriate legal channels. Amy stayed in her quarters, watching through the window as a woman she had never met paced the driveway with the predatory patience of someone who always got what she wanted eventually. Miranda was beautiful. Even from a distance, Amy could see that. Dark hair, elegant features, the kind of poise that came from a lifetime of privilege. She looked like the kind of woman who had never been refused anything, the kind of woman who destroyed anyone foolish enough to say no. When Victor finally convinced her to leave, Miranda paused at the gates. She looked directly at the window where Amy was watching, and she smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was a promise, a declaration of war. Amy felt the cold settle into her bones. This woman had nearly destroyed George once. She had used his vulnerability, his loneliness, his desperate hope for connection as weapons against him. And now she was back, ready to do it again, ready to take everything he had rebuilt. That night, George collapsed. Amy found him in his study, unconscious on the floor, his skin pale, his breathing shallow. The medical equipment that monitored his condition was alarming in ways she did not understand. She called for help. The estate's medical team arrived within minutes. They worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had prepared for this moment. They stabilized him. They administered emergency treatment. They spoke in medical terminology that Amy could not follow. Hours passed. Amy sat beside his bed in the medical wing. She held his hand and watched his face and tried not to think about what would happen if he did not wake up. At 3 a.m, his eyes opened. "Amy, I am here." She squeezed his hand. "I am right here. What happened? You collapsed. The stress, the doctors think. Your treatment needs adjustment. Miranda." "Yes." Amy's voice hardened. "Miranda happened, but you are going to be fine. The doctors are adjusting your protocol. You just need to rest." George's eyes were clouded with medication, but underneath the fog, she could see fear. "If I die," he whispered, "she wins. You are not going to die." Amy leaned closer. "Do you hear me? You are not going to die. We are going to fight her together. We are going to prove that her documentation is fabricated. We are going to show the world who she really is. How? I do not know yet. But I will figure it out." Amy pressed a kiss to his forehead. "You showed up for me. You watched me from the shadows because you could not stay away. You risked everything to tell me the truth about who you are. Now it is my turn to show up for you. You do not have to do this." "Yes, I do." Amy's voice carried a conviction that surprised even herself. "Because you are mine now, and I protect what is mine." She stayed by his bed until he fell asleep. Then she went to find Victor Kane. They met in the library. The estate's legal counsel was exhausted, but alert. He had been expecting her. "Tell me everything," Amy said. "Every detail of Miranda's lawsuit, every piece of evidence she claims to have, every weakness in her case." Victor studied her for a long moment, assessing, evaluating. "You are not planning to run," he observed. "No. Even though running would protect you? Running would not protect me. It would just delay the destruction. Miranda is going to try to destroy me whether I stay or leave. The only question is whether I am going to let her." Victor nodded slowly, a new respect in his expression. "The lawsuit is built on fabricated documentation," he began. "Miranda claims she co-developed key elements of George's neural pathway research. She has papers allegedly signed by George acknowledging her contribution. She has emails supposedly demonstrating their collaboration, but the documentation is fake. Yes, the problem is proving it. George was incapacitated during the time Miranda claims these documents were created. He cannot definitively state he did not sign them, and Miranda was careful to create evidence that is difficult to disprove. What about the original research records? They exist, but they are technical, complex, the kind of evidence that requires expert interpretation, and experts can be bought." Amy thought for a long moment, her mind working through the problem the way it worked through damaged paintings, looking for what remained underneath the destruction, looking for the original truth that could be recovered. "What about the timing?" Victor raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Miranda claims she contributed to research that was completed years before she met George. If we can prove that the key discoveries were made before she entered his life, her claims fall apart. She cannot have contributed to something that was already finished." Victor was quiet, processing. His expression shifted from skepticism to consideration. "That could work," he admitted, "if we can establish a clear timeline. If we can demonstrate that the patents she is claiming were filed before she had any access to George's work." "Where are those records?" "At the company, archived. It would take time to compile them, but it could be done." "Then do it," Amy said. "Pull every filing, every timestamp, Every piece of evidence that proves the research existed before Miranda existed in George's life. This will require significant resources. Use whatever resources you need. Amy's voice carried authority she had not known she possessed. George spent 7 years hiding from Miranda, letting her control his life through fear. That ends now. We are not hiding anymore. We are fighting. Victor stood, extended his hand. Miss Morrison, I have worked for George Rogers for 15 years. I have never seen anyone willing to fight for him the way you are willing to fight. Amy shook his hand. He is worth fighting for, even if he does not believe it yet. She spent the next 2 weeks building a case. Every day she sat with George during his recovery. Every night she worked with Victor to assemble evidence that would destroy Miranda's claims. She reached out to contacts she had not spoken to since Boston. People who owed her favors. People who remembered the truth about what had happened at Morrison Gallery. She discovered something surprising. Not everyone had believed Claire's version of events. Not everyone had chosen David's side. There were people who had watched the destruction unfold and recognized it for what it was. People who had been waiting for Amy to reach out. People who were willing to help. Elena flew to Maine to support her sister. She brought legal expertise and emotional reinforcement and the fierce protectiveness of someone who had watched Amy rebuild from nothing. You found someone worth fighting for, Elena observed after meeting George for the first time. I was not sure you would ever let yourself care about anyone again. Neither was I, Amy admitted. But here we are. Here you are, Elena agreed. Fighting a billionaire's war because you love him. Amy did not deny it. The word had not been spoken between them. Not yet. But it was present in every action she took. Every hour she spent building the case that would save him. Every moment she sat by his bed and held his hand and reminded him that he was not alone. Love was not something she had planned for. It was not something she had believed she was still capable of feeling. But it had found her anyway, in the darkness of midnight rooms, in the careful attention of a man who had watched her from shadows, in the choice to stay when leaving would have been easier. She loved him, and she was going to prove it by destroying the woman who had tried to destroy him first. The final confrontation was approaching. Miranda had accelerated her legal strategy. She was pushing for immediate arbitration rather than extended litigation. She wanted resolution before George's legal team had time to build their countercase. But Amy was ready. The timeline documentation was complete. The evidence proved conclusively that George's key patents had been filed before Miranda entered his life. Her claims of contribution were impossible. More importantly, Amy had found something else. Something that would destroy Miranda's credibility entirely. During her investigation, Amy had discovered that Miranda had tried this before. 10 years earlier, she had attached herself to another medical researcher, another man with valuable patents, another target she had tried to defraud. That attempt had failed. The researcher had recognized her manipulation before she could execute her plan. He had documented everything. He had kept records that proved Miranda's pattern of predatory behavior. He was willing to testify. The arbitration was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. George was finally strong enough to attend. Amy sat beside him in the conference room, Victor on his other side. Across the table, Miranda and her legal team projected confident aggression. "We are here to resolve the matter of patent ownership," the arbitrator began. "Miss Chen, you claim co-development of research belonging to Mr. Rogers. Please present your evidence." Miranda smiled. The same predatory smile Amy had seen from her window. She began presenting her fabricated documentation with the smooth confidence of someone who expected to win. Amy waited. Victor waited. George reached under the table and took Amy's hand. When Miranda finished her presentation, the arbitrator turned to George's team. "Mr. Rogers, what is your response?" Victor stood, but before he could speak, Amy rose instead. "May I address the panel?" The arbitrator looked surprised. This was not typical procedure, but after a moment's consideration, he nodded. Amy walked to the center of the room. She looked at Miranda directly, not with hatred, not with fear, with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the truth and was about to share it. "The documentation Miss Chen has presented is fabricated," Amy began, "and I can prove it." She presented the timeline evidence. Patent filings dated years before Miranda's first contact with George, research publications that established priority, documented witnesses who could verify that the key discoveries were made when George was working alone. Miranda's confidence faltered, but she recovered quickly. These records could have been backdated, she argued. George Rogers controlled the company. He could have manipulated any timeline he wanted. Amy smiled. She had been waiting for this objection. Perhaps, she agreed. But can you explain this? She presented the documentation from Miranda's previous target, the researcher who had recognized her pattern, the evidence of her previous attempted fraud, the statements he had provided describing her methods. The arbitration room went silent. Miranda's face had gone pale. Her legal team was conferring in urgent whispers. The arbitrator was reviewing the new evidence with growing concern. You have done this before, Amy said clearly. You identify vulnerable targets. You manufacture relationships. You fabricate documentation. And you destroy anyone who threatens to expose you. But you made a mistake this time. You assumed George was still alone. You assumed no one was paying attention. You were wrong. She turned to face the arbitrator. Miss Chen's claims should be dismissed entirely. More than that, I believe there is sufficient evidence here to warrant investigation of her previous activities. She is not a victim seeking rightful recognition. She is a predator who has finally been caught. The silence stretched. Then the arbitrator spoke. Miss Chen, do you have any response to these allegations? Miranda stood. Her composure was gone. The elegant predator had become something desperate. Cornered. This is a setup, she hissed. That woman, she pointed at Amy, is manipulating George the same way she claims I did. She appeared out of nowhere. She attached herself to a vulnerable man. She is using this lawsuit to cement her own position. Amy did not flinch. I appeared in response to a job posting. I was hired through a standard process by an employment agency that had no knowledge of George's condition or circumstances. I have documentation of every step of my hiring. Can you say the same about your relationship with George? Miranda had no answer, because there was no answer that would not incriminate her further. The arbitrator made his decision quickly. The lawsuit was dismissed. Counterclaims were filed, and Miranda Chen walked out of the conference room with her legal team in disarray and her reputation in ruins. George turned to Amy with an expression of wonder. You destroyed her. No. Amy took his hand. The truth destroyed her. I just made sure everyone could see it. But the victory was not the ending. It was the beginning of something new. The aftermath of the arbitration took months to resolve. Criminal investigations into Miranda's previous activities. Legal proceedings that ensured she could never threaten George again. Media attention that finally told the true story of what had happened to him. Through all of it, Amy stayed. She stayed through the difficult days when George's treatment needed adjustment. She stayed through the moments when he doubted whether the danger was really over. She stayed through the slow process of learning to trust that the people who said they loved him actually meant it. Because she did love him. She had finally said the words out loud. And he had said them back. I love you, George whispered one night as they lay together watching the moonlight on the ocean. I love you in ways my broken brain should not be capable of processing. You restored me, not by fixing anything, by seeing what was damaged and staying anyway. I love you too, Amy replied. Again, still, always. She kissed him in the darkness, the way she had been kissed so many nights before she knew who was visiting her room. The sensation that had once seemed impossible was now familiar. Known, cherished. They had found each other in the shadows. Two broken people who had survived betrayal and learned that survival was not enough. Two people who had taken the terrifying risk of connection and discovered that the risk was worth taking. The story did not end there. Real stories never truly end. They continue in the small moments, the daily choices, the ongoing work of trusting and being trusted. But in that moment, lying together in the moonlight, Amy and George both knew the same truth. They had been haunted by loneliness. They had been visited by fear. They had believed they would spend their lives alone because aloneness was safer than risking destruction. And then they had found each other, and everything had changed. 1 year after Miranda's defeat, Amy stood in the restored gallery of Hartwell Estate and surveyed her work. The room had been neglected for decades. Water damage from a roof leak that had gone unrepaired during George's years of isolation. Paintings that had been stored improperly. Frames that had warped and cracked. The kind of destruction that most experts would have declared beyond saving. Amy had saved it anyway. Every painting had been restored. Every frame had been repaired or replaced. The gallery now held 63 pieces that told the story of art spanning 4 centuries. And in the center of the room, illuminated by carefully positioned lighting, hung the smoke-damaged Victorian portrait Amy had been working on when George first revealed himself. Lady Patience, as Amy still called her, looked down from her place of honor with the same determined expression she had worn when Amy first uncovered her from beneath layers of damage. Her eyes still seemed to follow you around the room. Her presence still commanded attention. "She survived," George said from the doorway. Amy turned to find him watching her with an expression that still made her heart skip, even after a year of seeing it daily. She was always going to survive. She just needed someone patient enough to find her underneath all that damage. George crossed the room to stand beside her. He slipped his arm around her waist with the easy intimacy of someone who had finally learned that touch did not have to be feared. "You could be describing yourself," he observed. "I could be describing both of us." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking at the portrait, looking at the evidence of what patience and care could accomplish. The past year had transformed both of them in ways neither had anticipated. George had emerged from isolation gradually. First, small meetings with trusted business associates. Then, larger gatherings that tested his capacity for social interaction. Then, finally, public appearances that announced to the world that George Rogers was not dead or dying or hiding. He was living, really living, for the first time in 7 years. The treatment continued, of course. Daily injections that supported the neural pathways his condition had damaged. Regular monitoring to ensure the protocol remained effective. But the doctors had noticed something remarkable. George's brain was healing. Not completely. The damage from years of isolation could never be fully reversed. But the progression of his condition had not just stopped, it had begun to reverse. The pathways that had been pruning themselves were now strengthening. The capacity for connection that had been deteriorating was now expanding. The doctors attributed it to the treatment adjustments they had made after his collapse. George knew better. It was Amy. Her presence had done what no pharmaceutical compound could accomplish alone. Her consistency had taught his brain that connection was safe. Her love had provided the stimulation that damaged neural pathways needed to begin rebuilding. She had not just restored paintings, she had restored him. Amy's transformation had been equally profound, though less medically dramatic. The woman who had arrived at Hartwell Estate 18 months earlier had been running, hiding from a world that had betrayed her. Convinced that solitude was the only protection against future destruction, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that survival and living were not the same thing. Someone who had taken the terrifying risk of connection and discovered that the risk was worth taking. Someone who had found purpose not just in her work but in her relationship, in her commitment to another person, in her willingness to fight for something beyond herself. Elena noticed the change during her monthly visits. "You laugh now," Elena observed during one such visit. Real laughter. Not the polite sounds you used to make when you thought you should be amused. Actual joy. "I have reasons to laugh," Amy replied. "You have George. I have more than George. I have work that matters. I have a home that feels safe. I have a future I actually want to live into rather than just endure. That is the most un-Amy thing I have ever heard you say. Maybe I am not the same Amy anymore." Elena had hugged her then, tightly, the embrace of a sister who had watched destruction and was now witnessing resurrection. "I am so proud of you," Elena whispered, "for surviving, for rebuilding, for being brave enough to love someone after everything that happened." "I am proud of me too," Amy admitted. And that might be the biggest change of all. The anniversary of their first real conversation arrived on a Tuesday. George had been planning something. Amy could tell from the way he deflected her questions and arranged for her studio to be closed for the day. Something was happening. She just did not know what. He found her in the gallery that morning. She was examining Lady Patience, making notes about a minor touch-up that would need to happen before the painting was moved to its permanent location. "Come with me," George said. "Where are we going?" "It is a surprise. I do not like surprises. You will like this one." He took her hand and led her through the estate, past the rooms she knew, through corridors she had never explored, upstairs that seemed to lead nowhere until suddenly they led somewhere extraordinary. The observation tower at the highest point of Hartwell Estate, a circular room with windows on every side, views of the ocean stretching to the horizon, the kind of space that made you feel simultaneously small and infinite. "I did not know this existed," Amy breathed. "No one does. I have not been up here in years." I used to come here when I first bought the estate. Before Miranda, before the isolation became complete, I would stand here and look at the ocean and imagine a future I did not believe was possible. What future? George turned to face her. His expression was serious but not worried, nervous but not afraid. A future where I was not alone, where I had someone to share this view with, where the beauty of the world was not just something I observed, but something I experienced with another person. Amy's heart was racing. She recognized this moment, recognized the significance of what was about to happen. George reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "I know it has only been a year," he said. "I know we have both been damaged in ways that might never fully heal. I know there are no guarantees, that either of us could still be hurt, that nothing is certain except the risk. George, let me finish." His voice was trembling but determined. "I have spent most of my life believing that avoiding risk was the same as being safe. I built walls so high that nothing could reach me, and I thought that was wisdom. I thought that was protection. It was survival," Amy said softly. "Yes, but I do not want to just survive anymore. I want to live. I want to feel everything, even the parts that might hurt. I want to wake up every morning next to someone who knows all my damage and chooses to stay anyway. I want you." He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Simple, elegant, a single stone that caught the light from the windows and scattered it into rainbows. "Amy Morrison," George said, "will you marry me?" The question hung in the air, the most terrifying question either of them had ever asked or been asked. The question that required them to believe that love could last, that trust could be rebuilt, that two broken people could build something unbreakable together. Amy looked at the ring, looked at the man holding it, looked at the ocean stretching endlessly beyond the windows. She thought about David, about the engagement that had ended in destruction, about the promises that had been lies wrapped in pretty words. She thought about the woman she had been when she arrived at Hartwell Estate, running, hiding, convinced she would never let anyone close enough to hurt her again. She thought about the woman she was now, standing in a tower overlooking the ocean, being offered forever by a man who had been equally broken, being asked to take a risk that could end in joy or devastation, and she realized something. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but the fear no longer controlled her. She could feel it and acknowledge it and choose something different anyway. She could be afraid and brave at the same time. "Yes," she said. George's expression transformed, hope and relief and joy flooding across his features. "Yes, yes." Amy took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger herself. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will take this risk with you. Yes, I choose you, today and tomorrow and every day after that for as long as we both have." George pulled her close, kissed her with all the passion and desperation and gratitude of a man who had been offered something he never believed he deserved. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "I love you too." Amy pulled back to look at him. Her fiancé, her future husband, the man whose nocturnal visits had haunted her until she learned to welcome them. "But George, I need you to understand something." "What?" "This does not erase the damage. Getting married does not mean we are healed. We are still going to have difficult days, moments when the fear comes back, times when we need reassurance that this is real." "I know." George cupped her face in his hands. "I am not expecting perfect. I am expecting work. I am expecting that we will both struggle sometimes, that we will both need patience, that we will both have to choose each other again and again, even when choosing is hard." "That sounds exhausting." "That sounds like love," George corrected. "Real love. Not the fantasy version that pretends everything is easy. The version that shows up even when showing up is difficult. The version that means something because it costs something." Amy smiled. "When did you become such a romantic?" "When I fell in love with a woman who talks to paintings and refuses to give up on broken things. You taught me that damage is not the end of the story, that patience and care can bring beauty back from the ashes, that the things worth having are the things worth fighting for." Tears were streaming down Amy's face, not sad tears, overwhelmed tears, the kind of crying that happens when your heart is so full it cannot hold everything it feels. "I thought I was done," she admitted. "When I came here, when I took this job, I thought my story was over. that everything important had already happened, and the rest was just survival. And now I think my story was just beginning. All of it, the destruction and the rebuilding, and this moment right here, it was all leading somewhere. I just could not see where until I arrived. They stood together in the observation tower, two people who had survived betrayal and learned that survival was not enough. Two people who had taken the terrifying risk of love and discovered that the risk was what made it meaningful. Below them, the ocean continued its endless motion. Above them, the sky stretched toward infinity. Around them, the walls of Hartwell Estate no longer felt like a prison, but like a sanctuary. They had found each other, against all odds, against all expectations, against every wall they had built to keep love out. And they had chosen to stay. I need to pause here and speak directly to you one final time. We are approaching the end of Amy and George's story. But before I tell you how they built their life together, I need to ask you something important. Have you ever believed your story was over? Have you ever convinced yourself that the damage was too severe, the betrayal too complete, the future too bleak to bother hoping for anything better? If you have, I need you to hear this. Your story is not over. The worst thing that ever happened to you is not the last chapter. You are not defined by the people who hurt you or the choices you made when you were broken or the walls you built to protect yourself from more pain. You are defined by what you do next, by the risks you choose to take, by the love you allow yourself to feel, even when feeling is terrifying, by the courage to believe that someone might see all your damage and stay anyway. Amy Morrison thought she was done. George Rogers thought connection would kill him. They were both wrong, and their wrongness gave them the life they never believed they could have. If this story has meant something to you, I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who has given up on love, someone who thinks they are too broken for connection, someone who needs to hear that second chances are real and redemption is possible, and sometimes the most impossible dreams turn out to be exactly what you needed. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson Stories and turn on notifications. Comment below and tell me your story. Tell me about the time you thought everything was over and discovered you were wrong. Tell me about the person who saw your damage and stayed anyway. Tell me about the risk you took that changed your life. Your stories matter. This community matters. Together we are building something that proves happily ever after is not about perfection. It is about two imperfect people deciding every single day that they are worth the work. Now let me tell you how Amy and George built their forever. The wedding was small. Neither of them wanted spectacle. Neither of them needed to prove anything to the world. What they needed was a ceremony that honored who they actually were, two people who had found each other in darkness and learned to build light together. They married in the gallery of Hartwell Estate, surrounded by the paintings Amy had restored, with Lady Patience watching from her place of honor like a determined guardian angel. Elena served as maid of honor. Victor Kane served as best man, having earned the position through 15 years of loyalty and the critical role he played in saving George from Miranda. The guest list was small. A few colleagues from Amy's past who had remained loyal despite David's lies. A few associates from George's company who had proven themselves trustworthy. The estate staff who had become like family over the months of Amy's residence. No media. No photographers except Elena's husband who agreed to document the day without sharing the images publicly. No spectacle. Just two people, making promises they intended to keep. Amy wore a simple white dress she had designed herself. No elaborate train or excessive ornamentation, just clean lines and elegant fabric that moved beautifully when she walked. George wore a suit he had owned for years but never had occasion to wear, something he had purchased during his brief engagement to Miranda and then hidden in a closet, unable to look at it without remembering what she had done. Amy had found it while helping him organize his closet. She had told him to wear it. Why? He had asked. Because you are taking it back. She had been firm. You are not letting her control what you wear or how you feel or what this suit means. It is just fabric. We are giving it a new story. He had agreed. And standing in the gallery waiting for Amy to walk toward him, he understood what she meant. The suit was no longer a reminder of betrayal. It was a symbol of resurrection, of taking something damaged by the past and restoring it for a new purpose. She had taught him that. Through her work, through her love, through her stubborn insistence that nothing was beyond saving if you were patient enough to try. When Amy appeared at the gallery entrance, George forgot how to breathe. She was beautiful, not just physically, though she was certainly that, but beautiful in the way that people become beautiful when they are fully themselves, when they have stopped hiding or pretending or dimming their light to make others comfortable. Amy walked toward him with her head high, her eyes never leaving his, her steps steady and certain. She was not running anymore, she was arriving. They exchanged vows they had written themselves. George spoke first. Amy, when I met you, I was a man who had given up on connection. I had convinced myself that isolation was the same as safety, that needing no one was the same as being whole, that I could build walls so high that nothing could ever hurt me again. I was wrong about all of it. You showed me that damage is not the end of the story, that patience and care can heal what seemed beyond repair, that the scariest risks are often the ones most worth taking. I promised to show up for you, not just today but every day, not just when things are easy, but especially when they are hard. I promised to be present even when presence is difficult, to choose you again and again even when choosing requires effort, to love you not despite your damage but alongside it, because your damage is part of what made you the person I fell in love with. You restored me, not by fixing what was broken, but by convincing me that broken things still have value. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the gift you have given me. Amy's eyes were streaming with tears, but she spoke her own vows clearly. George, when I came to Hartwell Estate, I was running from a world that had betrayed me, from people who had used my trust as a weapon, from my own belief that I was capable of judging who deserved to be let close. I came here to hide, to disappear into work that could not hurt me, to spend my life surrounded by beautiful things that could not betray me the way beautiful people had. And then you appeared, in shadows and moonlight and whispered words I could not quite understand. You haunted me before I knew your name. You chose me before I knew I was being chosen. I did not trust you at first. I did not trust myself to trust anyone, but you showed up anyway, consistently, patiently. You proved through actions what words could never have convinced me to believe. I promise to stay, not because I am unafraid, but because my love for you is stronger than my fear. I promise to choose you even when choosing is hard, to build with you even when building requires tearing down walls I spent years constructing, to love you completely, damage and all, because your damage is what allowed you to see mine. You saw me, really saw me, not the performance I put on for the world, but the truth I had hidden from everyone, including myself. And you stayed. I promised to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret that choice. The officiant pronounced them married. George kissed Amy with the reverence of someone who understood the magnitude of what they had built. And in the gallery of Hartwell Estate, surrounded by paintings that had been brought back from the edge of destruction, two people who had been equally damaged began their life together. The years that followed were not perfect. Amy would never claim they were. She knew better than to pretend that love erased difficulty. That marriage meant the end of struggle, that choosing someone once eliminated the need to choose them again and again. George's condition continued to require management. The treatment remained a daily necessity. There were difficult days when his brain simply would not cooperate, when the old patterns of isolation tried to reassert themselves, when he retreated into silence, and Amy had to be patient enough to wait him out. But those days grew less frequent over time. The neural pathways that had been damaged continued to heal. The capacity for connection that had been deteriorating continued to expand. George became more present, more engaged, more capable of the intimacy that had once seemed impossible. The doctors called it remarkable, unprecedented. They wanted to study him, to understand how love and connection had accomplished what pharmaceuticals alone could not. George declined their study requests. Some things were too precious to be dissected. Some mysteries were better left unexplained. Amy's work evolved as well. She continued restoring paintings. But she also began teaching others, sharing the philosophy and techniques she had developed over decades of practice, building a program at Hartwell Estate that trained the next generation of restoration specialists. Students came from around the world, young people who had been told that damaged art was beyond saving. Amy taught them to see differently, to understand that damage was not the end of the story, that patience and care could accomplish what seemed impossible. She was teaching them about more than restoration. She was teaching them about hope. The Morrison Rogers Foundation for Art Preservation became one of the most respected institutions in the field. They funded restoration projects around the world. They provided training for emerging specialists. They protected cultural heritage that would otherwise have been lost. It was Amy's legacy, built on the same principles that had saved her own life. Nothing is beyond repair if you are willing to do the work. 5 years after their wedding, Amy stood once again in the observation tower of Hartwell Estate. The view had not changed. Ocean stretching to the horizon, sky reaching toward infinity, the same beauty that had witnessed George's proposal. But Amy had changed. She was 42 now. Her dark hair showed threads of silver that she refused to hide. Her face carried lines that told the story of 5 years of laughter and love and occasional tears. She was holding a photograph. The image showed 2 children, a boy and a girl, twins, 3 years old, playing in the gardens of Hartwell Estate with the joyful abandon of children who had never known anything except love. Adoption had not been their first choice. They had tried other options, but biology had not cooperated, and eventually they had realized that building a family did not require genetic connection. It only required love. Michael and Eleanor Rogers had come to them as infants, premature and fragile and in need of exactly the kind of patient care that Amy and George had learned to provide. They were not fragile anymore. They were loud and messy and demanding in the way all children are. They tested boundaries and threw tantrums and required constant attention. Amy loved every moment of it. She had not expected to become a mother, had convinced herself during the dark years after Boston that motherhood was not something she was suited for, that her own damage would inevitably harm anyone she tried to raise. She had been wrong about herself, about what damaged people were capable of giving. Her children were not damaged by her past. They were enriched by it. They had a mother who understood that failure was not fatal, that mistakes could be recovered from. That love meant showing up even when showing up was hard. They had a father who had learned the same lessons through his own journey, who could teach them that isolation was not protection, that connection was worth the risk, that the walls you build to keep pain out often keep joy out as well. George appeared in the doorway of the observation tower. There you are. I have been looking for you. I was just thinking, about what? About how different everything is. Amy turned to face him. 5 years ago you proposed to me in this room. I said yes even though I was terrified, even though I did not know if either of us was capable of building what we were promising to build. And now we have a life I never imagined possible. Work that matters. Children who drive us crazy in the best possible way. A home that actually feels like home. Do you regret any of it? Not one moment. Amy crossed to stand beside him. Not the fear or the struggle or the difficult days. All of it led here. All of it made this possible. George pulled her close. They stood together looking out at the ocean. The same view they had shared 5 years earlier. The same beauty that had witnessed the beginning of their forever. I love you, George said. I love you too. I am still afraid sometimes. Still waiting for something to go wrong. Still expecting the other shoe to drop. So am I, Amy admitted. I do not think that ever goes away completely. The damage leaves marks even after it heals. Then what do? We keep choosing each other anyway. We acknowledge the fear and refuse to let it control us. We build something beautiful despite the risk that it might eventually break. George kissed her forehead. When did you become so wise? When I fell in love with a man who visited my room in the darkness because his unconscious mind knew what his conscious mind was too afraid to admit. You taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to act despite fear, to reach for connection even when connection might hurt. I thought you taught me that. Maybe we taught each other. They stood together in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have learned each other completely, who have mapped every wound and chosen to stay anyway, who have built trust through consistent action rather than empty promises. Below them, in the gardens of Hartwell Estate, the twins were playing some elaborate game that involved running and shouting and occasionally falling down laughing. Their children, their family, their future. Amy thought about the woman who had arrived at this estate 4 years earlier, running from betrayal, hiding from a world that had hurt her, convinced she would spend her life alone because alone was safer than risking more destruction. That woman was gone, transformed by love and patience and the stubborn belief that nothing was beyond repair. In her place stood someone new, someone who had learned that survival was not the same as living, someone who had taken the terrifying risk of connection and discovered that the risk was what made life meaningful. I have a confession, Amy said. What? Sometimes I still feel him. in the middle of the night. That sensation on my neck, the warmth that does not belong to me, the ghost of lips against my pulse. George smiled. That is not a ghost. That is me. I know, but it still feels like a dream, like something impossible that somehow became real, like I fell asleep alone and woke up to find that everything I thought I had lost was waiting for me in the darkness. You were never alone, George said. Even before we met, I was watching. I was waiting. Some part of me knew you were coming, that you would be the one who finally made this estate feel like home. The billionaire's bite on her neck had made her tremble every night. She had thought it was a dream, a phantom sensation created by loneliness and longing. But it was not a dream. It was a promise, a silent declaration made by a man who could not yet speak the words, a reaching out in the darkness by someone who had forgotten how to reach for anything in daylight. And she had reached back. That was the secret Amy had learned. That was the truth she carried with her every day. Love was not the absence of damage. It was the willingness to be damaged together, to show your cracks to someone else and trust that they would not use those cracks against you, to see someone else's wounds and choose to stay anyway. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and the most rewarding. The twins called from the garden, demanding attention, requiring presence, being children in all their loud, messy, wonderful complexity. George took Amy's hand. Ready, always. They descended from the observation tower together, leaving behind the view that had witnessed so many pivotal moments, returning to the life they had built through courage and persistence and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other. The story did not end there. Real stories never truly end. They continue in the small moments, the daily choices, the ongoing work of loving and being loved. But in that moment, walking hand in hand toward their children, Amy and George both knew the same truth. They had been haunted by loneliness. They had been visited by fear. They had believed they would spend their lives alone because aloneness was safer than risking destruction. And then they had found each other, in shadows and moonlight, and whispered words that gradually became clear. The billionaire's bite on her neck had made her tremble every night. She had thought it was a dream. It was better than a dream. It was real, and real, as they had both learned, was worth every risk. Thank you for staying with me until the end of Amy and George's story. If you are still here, if you watched or listened to this entire journey, then something about their story spoke to something inside you. Maybe you recognized yourself in Amy's determination to survive. Maybe you understood George's fear of connection. Maybe you simply needed to believe that broken people can find their way to wholeness. Whatever brought you here, I need you to know that your presence matters. This community matters. The stories we tell each other about love and loss and the terrifying courage it takes to try again, these stories have power. They remind us that we are not alone, that our struggles are shared, that the darkness we carry is not unique, even though it feels that way sometimes. If this story moved you, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, not because it helps the algorithm, though it does, but because it tells me that this story mattered to you, that the hours I spent crafting it meant something to someone. Subscribe to Mr. Dawson's Stories and turn on notifications. I have more stories to tell, more journeys to share, more proof that happily ever after is possible for people who have been shattered and rebuilt. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You know who they are. The friend who has given up on love, the family member who believes they are too damaged for connection, the stranger you will never meet who will stumble across this video at exactly the moment they need it most. And finally, drop a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me about the person who saw your damage and stayed anyway. Tell me about the risk you took that changed your life. Tell me about the love you found in unexpected places. Your stories are important. They are the reason I do this work. Every comment I read reminds me that we are all carrying wounds, that we are all searching for someone who will see those wounds and choose to stay, that we are all capable of both tremendous damage and tremendous love. Amy Morrison thought she was done. George Rogers thought connection would kill him. They were both wrong. And maybe, just maybe, you are wrong too, about what is possible, about what you deserve, about whether anyone will ever see the real you and stay anyway. The truth is, you do not know what is waiting for you in the darkness. You do not know who is watching from the shadows, gathering courage to reach for you. You do not know what impossible dream might turn out to be exactly what you needed. All you can do is stay open to the possibility. Keep going despite the fear. keep reaching, even when reaching has hurt you before. Because sometimes the bite on your neck in the middle of the night is not a threat. Sometimes it is a promise. And sometimes the most impossible stories turn out to be true. Until next time, remember this. Every ending is just a new beginning waiting to happen. Every scar is proof that you survived. Every wall you built for protection can become a door when you are finally ready to open it. Your story is not over. The best part might be just beginning. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing. Thank you for being part of this community where broken things are valued and second chances are celebrated and love is always worth the risk. I am Mr. Dawson, and I will see you in the next story.